You won't believe what happened when George Strait found a 50-year-old letter. The ending will make you cry. The autumn rain drummed against the old wooden shutters of the Texas ranch house like fingers tapping an impatient rhythm on a kitchen table. George Strait stood at the living room window, watching the droplets race down the glass panes, each one carrying with it fragments of the grey October sky. At 72, his hands still bore the calluses of a working man, though these days they came more from guitar strings than cattle ropes. The legendary country singer had built an empire on authenticity, and even now, decades after his first #1 hit, he refused to let fame soften the edges that had made him who he was. Behind him, the comfortable sounds of domestic life filled the air. Norma was in the kitchen, preparing what smelled like her famous chicken and dumplings, a recipe she had perfected over their 54 years of marriage. The familiar clatter of dishes and the soft hum of her voice as she worked brought a warmth to the house that no amount of money could buy. George had performed for millions, sold more records than most artists could dream of, but nothing compared to these quiet moments at home with the woman who had stood by his side through every triumph and tragedy. "George, honey, could you bring down those Christmas decorations from the attic?" Norma called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it had held since they were teenagers in Pearsall. "I know it's only October, but I want to sort through everything before the holidays rush up on us." He smiled, remembering how she had always been the organized one in their relationship. While he chased dreams across honky-tonk stages and recording studios, she had been the anchor that kept their family grounded. "Sure thing, sweetheart," he replied, pulling himself away from the window and the memories it seemed to hold in its rain-streaked surface. The narrow stairs to the attic creaked under his weight, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the decades they had lived in this house. Dust motes danced in the weak light, filtering through a single small window, and the air held that peculiar smell of stored memories, old wood, forgotten fabric, and time itself. Cardboard boxes sat stacked against the rafters like silent sentinels, guarding the relics of a life well lived. As George reached for the box clearly marked "Christmas Fragile" in Norma's careful handwriting, his shoulder brushed against a smaller wooden chest he had not noticed in years. The impact sent it sliding across the dusty floor, and something rattled inside like dice in a gambler's hand. Curious, he knelt down and examined the small treasure chest, its brass hinges green with age, and its cedar surface worn smooth by countless hands. If you're enjoying this story of rediscovered love and hidden treasures, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers about how these stories touch your hearts, and your support means the world to us as we continue bringing you these emotional journeys. George could not remember the last time he had opened this particular box. His fingers worked at the stubborn latch, coaxing it open with the patience of a man who had learned that the best things in life could not be rushed. Inside, a collection of his past lay waiting like old friends at a high school reunion. There were photographs from his early performing days, when his hair was dark and his face unlined by years of sun and wind. Ticket stubs from concerts he had almost forgotten, pressed flowers that Norma had given him during their courtship, and a small stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. But it was not the bundle of letters that caught his attention. Beneath everything else pressed flat against the bottom of the chest lay a single envelope that made his heart skip like a scratched record. The paper had yellowed with age, and the edges were soft with handling, but the handwriting was unmistakably his own, though younger, more uncertain than the confident signature he now used to sign autographs for fans around the world. With hands that suddenly felt unsteady, George lifted the envelope and turned it over. There, in his 19-year-old script, was written simply, "For Norma, my heart's only home." The ink had faded to a rusty brown, and there were small stains on the paper that could have been tears, coffee, or just the patina of 5 decades spent hiding in the dark. He remembered writing this letter as if it had been yesterday, though the boy who had penned these words felt like a stranger now. It was November of 1971, just 3 months after he had met Norma at a high school dance in Pearsall. He had been so young then, so full of dreams that seemed impossible and love that felt too big for his chest to contain. He had written this letter in his childhood bedroom, pouring his heart onto the page with the desperate honesty that only comes with first love. But he had never given it to her. Fear had held him back, fear of rejection, fear of seeming too intense, fear of ruining the delicate magic that existed between them. Instead, he had kept it, telling himself that someday he would find the perfect moment, Some day had become months, then years, and eventually the letter had been forgotten, buried beneath the accumulating layers of a life lived fully. Now, as rain continued to fall outside and Norma hummed softly in the kitchen below, George carefully opened the envelope. The paper crackled like autumn leaves as he unfolded the letter, and his own words from half a century ago rose up to meet him like ghosts made flesh. "My dearest Norma," the letter began, and George could hear his younger self in every carefully chosen word. "I know we have only known each other for 3 months, but I need you to understand something that I am too scared to say out loud. From the moment I saw you at that dance, wearing that yellow dress that made you look like sunshine itself, I knew that my life had been divided into 2 parts, the time before I met you and everything that would come after." George felt his throat tighten as he read his own declaration of love, written with the absolute certainty that only the young possess. The letter went on to describe his dreams of making music, of building a life worthy of her love, of creating a family that would be his greatest achievement beyond any song he might write or stage he might grace. But it was the next paragraph that nearly brought him to his knees there in the dusty attic. "I want to tell you about the exact moment I knew I would love you forever," his younger self had written. "It was not when we first danced, though your hand in mine felt like coming home. It was not when you laughed at my terrible jokes, though that sound became my favorite song. It was 3 weeks after we met, when we were walking by Miller's Creek after that terrible thunderstorm. You saw that injured sparrow by the water's edge, and without hesitation you knelt down in the mud and cradled it in your hands. You spoke to that little bird like it was the most precious thing in the world, and in that moment I saw your heart completely. That was when I knew that I wanted to spend the rest of my life protecting that kindness, nurturing it, and being worthy of it." George lowered the letter, his vision blurred by tears he had not expected. He remembered that day by Miller's Creek with perfect clarity now, though he had never told Norma what it had meant to him. The sparrow had recovered and flown away, but the image of her gentle hands and caring heart had remained with him through every day of their marriage since. The letter continued with promises that seemed almost prophetic now. Young George had vowed to love her through whatever storms might come, to be her shelter and her strength, to build a life together that would stand as a testament to the power of true love. He had promised to write songs that would make her proud, to create a legacy that would honor the faith she had placed in him, and to never let the world change the man she had fallen in love with beneath that old oak tree behind the school gymnasium. Reading these words now, George marveled at how his 19-year-old self had somehow known exactly what their life together would require. Every promise in that letter had been kept, though neither of them could have imagined the tests that would come, the early years of struggle when he was just another dreamer with a guitar and a prayer, the gradual climb to success that brought its own challenges and temptations, the birth of their children and the joy that had filled their home like music made visible. And then came the paragraph that nearly broke his heart all over again, because it showed how even at 19, some part of him had understood that love was not just about the good times. "I promise you, Norma, that when the dark days come, and they will come because life is not a song where everything ends perfectly, I will hold your hand and we will face whatever storms await us together. I will love you when you are happy and when you are sad, when you are strong and when you need strength, when the world makes sense, and when it seems to have gone completely mad." Those words had proven to be more prophetic than he could have imagined when he wrote them. The dark days had indeed come, and the darkest of all had been that terrible night in 1986, when they received the phone call that shattered their world. Jennifer, their beautiful 13-year-old daughter, had been killed in a car accident while riding with friends. The pain had been so overwhelming that for months George was not sure their marriage would survive it. In his grief, he had pulled away from Norma when she needed him most, and she had done the same to him. They had become strangers living in the same house, each drowning in their own sorrow and unable to reach across the gulf that tragedy had carved between them. There had been nights when George wondered if love, no matter how strong, could survive such devastation. But somehow, they had found their way back to each other. It had taken time, patience, and the kind of forgiveness that can only exist between two people who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. They had learned that love was not just about sharing joy, but about sharing the weight of unbearable pain, until it became something they could carry together. Now sitting in the quiet attic with his own words from 50 years ago spread before him like a map of the life they had built together, George understood that this letter was more than just a relic of young love. It was proof that some part of his heart had always known what it would take to love Norma Strait for a lifetime, and evidence that every day of their marriage had been a fulfillment of promises made by a boy who believed in forever. The sound of Norma's voice calling his name from downstairs broke through his reverie. "George, did you get lost up there? Dinner's almost ready, and you know how I feel about cold dumplings." He carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope, but instead of returning it to the chest, he held it close to his chest. For 50 years these words had waited in the darkness, but tonight, he realized, it was time for them to finally find their way home to the woman they had been written for. As he made his way back downstairs, carrying both the Christmas decorations and the weight of half a century of unspoken love, George Strait made a decision that would change everything about the quiet evening he and his wife had planned to share together. The familiar warmth of the kitchen enveloped George like an old friend's embrace as he descended from the attic, the Christmas decoration box balanced in one arm, while the other hand clutched the precious envelope against his chest. Norma stood at the stove, her silver hair catching the soft light from the overhead fixture, stirring the dumplings with the same careful attention she had given to every meal she had prepared for their family over the decades. She wore the blue apron he had bought her for their 20th anniversary, now faded but still her favorite, and the sight of her in this domestic tableau filled him with a love so familiar it was like breathing. "There you are," she said without turning around. That intuitive awareness of his presence that came from a lifetime of shared spaces and synchronized hearts. "I was beginning to think you had decided to take up permanent residence in that dusty old attic." George set the decoration box down by the kitchen table and slipped the letter into his shirt pocket, feeling the paper crinkle softly against his chest. "Just got caught up looking through some old things," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor that he hoped she would not notice. "You know how it is when you start going through memories." Norma turned then, wooden spoon still in hand, and studied his face with the penetrating gaze that had seen through every attempt at deception he had ever made. After 54 years of marriage, she could read his moods like sheet music, interpreting every subtle change in expression as clearly as he could read the chord progressions in his favorite songs. "You look like you have seen a ghost," she observed, wiping her hands on her apron before reaching up to touch his cheek. Her fingers were warm and slightly damp from the kitchen steam, and they carried the scent of sage and comfort that he associated with home itself. "Are you feeling all right?" George covered her hand with his own, marveling at how perfectly her fingers still fit against his palm after all these years. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just feeling a little nostalgic, I suppose. This weather always makes me reflective." She studied him for another moment, her blue eyes searching his face for clues to the sudden shift in his demeanor. Norma had learned long ago that her husband was a man who kept his deepest feelings close to his chest, revealing them only in careful doses like a miser counting coins. It was not that he was secretive or distant, but rather that his emotions ran so deep that he sometimes needed time to find the words to express them adequately. "Well, whatever has got you so thoughtful, we can talk about it over dinner," she said finally, turning back to the stove to lift the lid on the pot of dumplings. Steam rose like incense, carrying with it the rich aroma of chicken and herbs that had been simmering all afternoon. "Everything is ready. Why do not you wash up while I get the table set?" As George stood at the kitchen sink, letting the warm water run over his hands, he caught sight of his reflection in the window above the basin. The face looking back at him was weathered by 7 decades of sun and wind, lined with the evidence of laughter and sorrow, success and struggle. But in his eyes, he could still see traces of the 19-year-old boy who had written that letter with such desperate hope and overwhelming love. What would that young man think if he could see them now, George wondered? Would he be proud of the life they had built together, or would he be disappointed that the fire of their early passion had settled into the steady warmth of companionate love? The question had been haunting him more frequently lately, especially during quiet moments like these when the house felt too big, and their conversations had become predictable patterns worn smooth by decades of repetition. It was not that he loved Norma any less now than he had when they were teenagers, fumbling their way through first love. If anything, his love for her had deepened and matured like good whiskey, becoming richer and more complex with age. But somewhere along the way, between raising children and building careers and surviving the unthinkable tragedy of losing Jennifer, they had stopped expressing that love with the raw honesty that had characterized their early years together. When was the last time he had told her exactly what she meant to him? Not just in the casual "love you too" that followed her own declarations, but in the detailed, specific way that his younger self had poured onto those pages upstairs. When was the last time he had looked into her eyes and told her about the precise moment he knew she was his destiny, or described the way her laugh could still make his heart skip like a teenager's? "Penny for your thoughts," Norma said, appearing beside him with plates in her hands. She had changed from her cooking apron into the soft cardigan he had given her last Christmas, and her hair was freshly combed. Even after all these years, she still made an effort to look nice for their quiet dinners together, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the respect she still held for their relationship. "They are worth more than a penny," George replied, drying his hands on the dish towel she offered him. "But I'm not sure I have the words to explain them properly." They moved through the familiar dance of setting the table together, a choreography perfected through thousands of shared meals. Norma placed the steaming bowls, while George folded napkins and arranged silverware, their movements synchronized like dancers who had been partners for a lifetime. The easy rhythm of these domestic rituals usually brought him peace, but tonight, the letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, reminding him of all the words that had gone unspoken between them. As they settled into their usual seats across from each other at the small oak table that had been a wedding gift from Norma's parents, George found himself studying his wife's face in the soft light of the dining room chandelier. She was still beautiful to him, though her beauty had evolved from the fresh-faced radiance of youth into something deeper and more substantial. The lines around her eyes spoke of decades of laughter, and the silver in her hair caught the light like precious metal. Her hands, now marked with age spots and the gentle arthritis that came with 7 decades of living, still moved with the same graceful efficiency that had first caught his attention at that high school dance so long ago. "You are staring," she said, looking up from her plate with a smile that held both amusement and curiosity. "What has gotten into you tonight? You have been acting strange ever since you came down from that attic." George took a breath, feeling the letter crinkle against his chest as his heart began to beat faster. This was the moment he had been both anticipating and dreading since he had discovered those yellowed pages. How did you give someone a love letter that was 50 years overdue? How did you explain that you had been carrying these words in your heart all this time, but had never found the courage to speak them aloud? "Norma," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. The words that had flowed so easily from his pen when he was 19 now seemed inadequate and clumsy in his mouth. She set down her fork and gave him her complete attention, the same focused presence she had always offered when he needed to work through something difficult. It was one of the qualities he loved most about her, this ability to create space for whatever he needed to say, whether it was about a song he was struggling to write or a problem he was trying to solve. "I found something today," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I wrote a long time ago. Something that was meant for you." Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she did not interrupt, sensing that this was one of those moments that required patience and careful attention. George reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the envelope, its edges soft with age and handling. He placed it on the table between them like an offering or perhaps a confession. "I wrote this in November of 1971, he said, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in the truth he was finally ready to share. 3 months after we started dating. I was going to give it to you, but I lost my nerve. I have been carrying it around ever since, and today when I found it again, I realized that some words are worth saying even when they are 50 years late." Norma stared at the envelope as if it might bite her, her expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching wonder. Slowly, almost reverently, she reached across the table and picked it up, turning it over to see her name written in his young hand. "You wrote me a letter when we were teenagers?" she asked, her voice soft with amazement. "And you never gave it to me?" George nodded, feeling heat rise in his cheeks like a schoolboy caught in mischief. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared you would think I was too intense, or that I would frighten you away with how much I already loved you. So I kept it, thinking I would give it to you when the time was right. But the right time never seemed to come, and eventually I forgot about it completely." Norma's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, and George watched her face as she began to read the words his younger self had written with such passionate certainty. He could see her eyes moving across the pages, and he found himself remembering every word, every declaration of love and promise for their future together. Her expression changed as she read, cycling through surprise, tenderness, and something that looked like recognition. Tears began to gather in her eyes, and George felt his own throat tighten in response. When she reached the part about the injured sparrow by Miller's Creek, she looked up at him with wonder written across her features. "You remember that day?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "With the little bird by the creek?" "Every detail," George replied honestly. "That was the moment I knew I would love you forever. I have never told you that before, but it has been true for 50 years. Norma continued reading, and George watched as tears began to roll down her cheeks unchecked. When she finished the letter, she folded it carefully and held it against her heart, just as he had done in the attic earlier. "George Strait," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever written to me. These words, these promises you made, you have kept every single one of them. Every single one." The silence that followed was not empty but full, charged with decades of shared history and the weight of words finally spoken. George reached across the table and took her free hand in his, marveling at how much could change and how much could stay exactly the same in the space of a single evening. But Norma was not finished. She wiped her eyes with her napkin, then stood abruptly from her chair. "Wait here," she said, her voice filled with an urgency that made his heart race. "Do not move. There is something I need to show you." She disappeared into their bedroom, leaving George alone at the table with the remnants of their dinner and the echo of her tears still visible in the candlelight. Whatever she was retrieving, it was clear that his 50-year-old letter had unlocked something in her as well, and he found himself holding his breath as he waited for her return, sensing that this evening was about to take a turn that neither of them could have anticipated when they sat down to share what they had expected to be. Just another quiet dinner together on a rainy October night. The moments that followed felt suspended in time, like the held breath between lightning and thunder. George sat alone at their dining table, his heart hammering against his ribs with the irregular rhythm of a man who had just stepped to the edge of a cliff without knowing how far the drop might be. The house around him seemed to hold its own breath, the familiar sounds of their evening routine replaced by an expectant silence that felt both thrilling and terrifying. From their bedroom came the soft sounds of Norma moving things around, the gentle thud of drawers being opened and closed, the whisper of fabric being moved aside. George found himself studying the letter she had left on the table, wondering what memories it had stirred in her mind, and what could possibly have prompted her sudden departure with such urgent purpose. When she returned, she carried in her hands a small wooden jewelry box that he recognized immediately. It had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who had understood the importance of keeping precious things safe. The mahogany surface was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the tiny brass key still hung from a faded ribbon that had once been deep blue, but had faded to the color of winter sky. But it was not the jewelry box itself that made George's breath catch in his throat. It was the way Norma held it, with the reverent care of someone carrying a sacred relic, and the expression on her face that mixed nervousness with anticipation and something that looked remarkably like mischief. "In all our years together," she said, settling back into her chair and placing the box on the table between them like a bridge spanning 50 years of marriage, "I have never told you about what I keep in here. You always respected my privacy, never asked what was inside, and I love you for that. But tonight I think it is time you knew." Her fingers worked at the tiny key with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ritual countless times over the years. The lock clicked open with a sound like a whispered secret, and she lifted the lid to reveal not the jewelry George had expected, but a collection of papers, photographs, and mementos that spoke of a lifetime of carefully preserved memories. But it was the envelope that she lifted from the very bottom of the box that made George's world tilt on its axis. Like his own letter, this one had yellowed with age, and the handwriting across its surface was unmistakably Norma's, though rendered in the careful cursive she had used as a teenager. And there, written in faded blue ink across the front, were the words that stopped his heart completely. "For George, my forever love." "November 1971, she said softly, holding the envelope as if it were made of butterfly wings and morning dew. "2 weeks after you walked me home from the harvest dance, I stayed up all night writing this, trying to find the words to tell you what you meant to me, what I hoped we could be together." George stared at the envelope as if it were an apparition, his mind struggling to process the impossible coincidence of what he was seeing. "You wrote me a letter too," he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse with amazement. Norma nodded, tears streaming freely down her cheeks now. I was going to give it to you at school the next Monday, but when I saw you in the hallway, you looked so nervous and uncertain that I lost my courage. I thought maybe you were having second thoughts about us, about whether someone like you could really want to be with someone like me for the long haul. She opened the envelope with the same careful reverence she had shown his letter, unfolding pages that crackled with age and the weight of words that had waited half a century to be shared. I kept telling myself I would give it to you later, when the moment felt right, but the right moment never seemed to come, and eventually it became this secret thing that I carried with me. I would read it sometimes, usually on our anniversary or when I was missing you during your tours, and it would remind me of the girl who fell in love with you and all the dreams we shared when we were young. George watched her face as she prepared to read from her own letter, seeing in her expression the same mixture of vulnerability and courage that he had felt when he handed his own words to her just minutes before. The symmetry of the moment was so perfect, it felt orchestrated by forces beyond their understanding, as if the universe itself had conspired to bring these two pieces of their past together on this particular rainy evening in October. "My dearest George," she began, her voice trembling with the weight of words that had lived in darkness for decades. "I hope someday I will have the courage to give you this letter, because there are things in my heart that I cannot seem to say out loud. When I am with you, the words get all tangled up with the butterflies in my stomach and the way you make me feel like I am flying and drowning all at the same time." George felt his own tears beginning to fall as he listened to his wife read the words her teenage heart had written to his teenage heart, words that had somehow found their way home after traveling through 50 years of separation. The girl who had written this letter was still there in the woman sitting across from him, still present in the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, still visible in the way her eyes sparkled when she was sharing something precious. "I want to tell you about the moment I knew I would love you until the day I die," Norma continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm in the familiar words. "It was not when you asked me to dance at the harvest dance, though my heart nearly stopped when you walked across that gymnasium floor like you were walking through fire to reach me. It was not when you sang that song under my bedroom window, though I will treasure that memory until my last breath." She paused, looking up at George with eyes that held all the wonder of first love and all the wisdom of mature devotion. "It was the next Tuesday, when we were walking to school and it started to pour rain. You took off your jacket and held it over my head, and when I told you that you would get soaked, you said that you would rather be wet for the rest of your life than let a single drop fall on me. In that moment, I saw the man you would become, the husband who would shelter me from every storm, and I knew that whatever else happened in my life, I wanted to face it all with you by my side." George's memory of that morning came flooding back with startling clarity. He had been so young, so eager to impress her, and the gesture had felt both grand and natural at the same time. That he had made such an impression, that she had carried that moment with her through all the years that followed, filled him with a pride and humility that left him speechless. The letter continued with dreams and promises that paralleled his own in ways that seemed almost mystical. Young Norma had written about wanting to build a life with him that would be an adventure, about supporting his musical dreams even when they seemed impossible, about creating a home together that would be filled with love and laughter, and children who would grow up knowing they were cherished. "I promise you, George, that I will love you through whatever comes," she read, her voice breaking with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "I will love you when you're confident, and when you doubt yourself, when the world celebrates you and when it seems to ignore you completely, when we have everything we want, and when we have to struggle for the basics. I will be your biggest fan, and your safest harbor, your adventure partner and your peace." As with his own letter, George marveled at how his teenage bride had somehow understood exactly what their marriage would require. Every promise in her letter had been kept, with a faithfulness that had sustained them through decades of challenge and change. She had indeed been his biggest fan, cheering from the front row of honky-tonk bars and from the wings of major concert venues with equal enthusiasm. She had been his safe harbor during the dark days after Jennifer's death, holding him when he could not hold himself together, and she had been his adventure partner through every twist and turn their life had taken. But it was the final paragraph of her letter that broke his heart and put it back together again all at once. I want to promise you something else, George Strait, she read, her voice barely above a whisper now. I promise that no matter how many years pass, no matter how familiar we become to each other, I will never stop seeing the magic in you that I see right now. I will never stop being amazed by your kindness, your talent, your gentle strength, and the way you make me feel like the most important person in your universe. And I hope that even when we are old and grey, sitting on our front porch watching our grandchildren play, you will still look at me sometimes and see the girl who fell so completely in love with you that she stayed up all night trying to find words big enough to hold it all. The silence that followed her reading was profound and sacred, filled with the presence of their younger selves and the weight of promises kept across half a century. George looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw simultaneously the teenage girl who had written those words and the woman who had spent a lifetime fulfilling them. The magic she had promised to always see in him was reflected back at him from her eyes, undimmed by age or familiarity, or the countless ordinary moments that make up a marriage. Norma, he said finally, his voice thick with wonder and gratitude. How is it possible that we both wrote letters we never gave to each other in the exact same month 50 years ago? She shook her head, laughing through her tears. I have no idea, but it feels like fate, does not it? Like some part of us knew these words needed to exist, even if we were not ready to share them yet. George reached across the table and took both of her hands in his, feeling the calluses from decades of caring for their family and home, feeling the slight tremor that spoke of 7 decades of living fully. Reading your letter, hearing those words that have been waiting all this time to find their way to me, it is like falling in love with you all over again. Not just with who you were then, but with who you have become. With every day you have chosen to keep those promises. They sat in the candlelight, holding hands across a table laden with the remnants of dinner and the treasures of their shared past, feeling like teenagers again, but with the wisdom that only comes from walking through life together for 54 years. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside their kitchen something had shifted. Some door had opened that they had not even realized had been closed. The letters lay between them like evidence of a love that had been true from the very beginning and had only grown stronger with time. And as they began to talk, really talk, about the dreams they had carried and the promises they had kept and the ways they had surprised even themselves with the depth of their commitment, both George and Norma felt something awakening in their hearts that they had thought might be gone forever, the breathless excitement of discovering that the person you love most in the world still has the power to surprise you, and that some kinds of magic only get stronger with age. The hours that followed their mutual revelations felt like stepping outside of time itself, as if the universe had granted them a reprieve from the ordinary passage of minutes and days, to exist in a space where past and present converged into something entirely new. George and Norma remained at their kitchen table long after their dinner had grown cold, the letters spread between them like a map of territories their hearts had explored separately but in perfect parallel. "Read that part again," George said, pointing to a section of his own letter that Norma held in her weathered hands, the part about the music. She cleared her throat softly and found the passage he meant. "I know my dreams of making music might seem foolish to some people, but when I hold my guitar and sing the songs that come from somewhere deep inside me, I feel like I am touching something sacred. I want to write songs that matter, Norma. Songs that tell the truth about love and loss and all the messy, beautiful parts of being human, and I want to do it all with you beside me, because your love makes me braver than I have any right to be." George shook his head in amazement. "I had completely forgotten I wrote that, but it is exactly what happened, is it not? Every song, every album, every night on stage, you were there making me braver." Norma set the letter down and reached across to touch his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines that years of laughter and worry had carved there. "You were already brave, sweetheart. I just provided the soft place to land when the bravery ran out." They had been talking for nearly 3 hours, moving through their letters line by line, sharing memories that the words had unlocked and marveling at how their teenage selves had somehow understood truths about love that had taken them decades to fully appreciate. It was as if they were archaeologists of their own relationship, carefully excavating layers of shared history and discovering treasures they had forgotten they possessed. "Look at this," Norma said, pointing to a section of her letter that had made George weep when she first read it aloud. "I wrote about wanting to grow old with you, about imagining us at 70 still holding hands and still finding new things to love about each other. When I was 18, 70 seemed impossibly old, like a lifetime away, and now here we are. George brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, tasting the salt of tears that had dried there. Here we are, he agreed. And I am still finding new things to love about you. Tonight has proven that. The conversation had not been without its difficult moments. When they reached the parts of their letters that dealt with future children and the joy they would bring, both had fallen silent, thinking of Jennifer and the way her loss had nearly shattered everything they had built together. But rather than avoiding that pain as they had learned to do over the years, tonight they faced it together, holding hands across the table as they remembered not just their daughter's death, but her life, the brightness she had brought to their world, and the ways her memory still lived in every song George sang and every meal Norma cooked with extra love. She would have loved knowing about these letters, Norma said softly, touching the faded pages with reverent fingers. Jennifer always said we were like something out of a fairy tale, the way we looked at each other even after all those years. I used to think she was just being romantic, but maybe she saw something we had forgotten how to see ourselves. George nodded, feeling the familiar ache of missing their daughter, but also, for the first time in years, a sense of peace about her memory. She saw the love story we have been living all along. Maybe that is what these letters are really about, not just remembering who we were, but recognizing who we still are, underneath all the years and routines. As the night deepened around them, they found themselves sharing stories they had never told each other, small moments and private thoughts that had seemed too intimate or too trivial to mention over the years, but now felt essential to understanding the full scope of their love. Norma told him about the journal she had kept during his early touring days, where she wrote letters to him every night he was away, pouring out her loneliness and pride and unwavering belief in his dreams. George confessed to writing songs about her that he had never recorded, melodies that captured private moments too precious to share with the world, but too beautiful to forget. "There is something else," George said, as the clock in their hallway chimed midnight. "Something I have been thinking about ever since I found that letter this afternoon." Norma, who had been tracing patterns on the tablecloth with her finger, looked up with tired but attentive eyes. The emotional intensity of the evening had drained them both, but neither seemed ready to break the spell by suggesting they go to bed. "What is it, honey?" George took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing at the edge of another cliff, but this time one he was ready to leap from. "These letters, what they have shown us about ourselves and about what we meant to each other, even when we were just kids, it has made me realize something important. We have gotten so comfortable with each other over the years that we stopped expressing the wonder of it all. We love each other deeply, completely, but we have stopped celebrating that love the way it deserves." He stood up and began pacing the small kitchen, his hands moving as they did when he was working through a complex musical arrangement. "Do you remember what it felt like in those early days? Not just the passion, though that was wonderful, but the sense that what we had was miraculous. The way we used to talk for hours about everything and nothing. The way we made each other feel like the most fascinating people in the world." Norma watched him move, seeing in his restless energy the same intensity that had drawn her to him when they were teenagers. "I remember," she said softly. "I remember feeling like we were the first two people who had ever been in love, like we had discovered something completely new." "Exactly." George stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes bright with excitement. "And the thing is, Norma, what we have now is even more miraculous than what we had then. We have loved each other through everything life could throw at us. We have seen each other at our worst and chosen to stay. We have built a life together that has weathered every storm and come out stronger." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with the same reverence he had shown the first time he asked her to dance. "I want to court you again," he said, his voice filled with the wonder of new discovery. "I want to write you letters and bring you flowers and tell you every day exactly what you mean to me. I want to remember what it feels like to be amazed by love instead of just comfortable with it." Tears began flowing down Norma's cheeks again, but these were different from the tears she had shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of a heart that had been waiting to hear exactly these words without even knowing it was waiting. "George Strait," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "are you asking me to fall in love with you all over again?" "I am asking you to let me fall in love with you all over again," he corrected gently, "because sitting here tonight reading these letters, seeing you cry over words I wrote 50 years ago, Watching you share pieces of your heart that you have been keeping private all this time, I realized that I never stopped falling in love with you. I just stopped paying attention to it." He brought her hands to his chest, letting her feel the rapid beating of his heart. "My heart is racing right now, just like it did that first night I walked you home from the dance. You still have that effect on me, Norma. You still make me feel like anything is possible." She leaned forward and kissed him then, a kiss that tasted of tears and time and the salt of enduring love. When they broke apart, she was smiling through her weeping, and George thought he had never seen anything more beautiful in his life. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it, to falling in love again, to being courted by my husband of 54 years, to remembering what it feels like to be amazed instead of just grateful." They held each other in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of their enduring love and the promise of rediscovered wonder. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern horizon. But inside their home, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new, as if they had been given the rare gift of a second chance at first love. As they finally made their way to bed, carrying the letters with them like treasures rescued from a shipwreck, both George and Norma felt something they had not experienced in years. The thrilling uncertainty of not knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring, coupled with the absolute certainty that whatever it was, they would face it together with hearts wide open to the endless possibilities of love. The boy and girl who had written those letters 50 years ago had grown into a man and woman who had lived those dreams and kept those promises. But more than that, they had discovered that true love is not just about finding the right person and holding on, but about choosing to keep discovering that person over and over again, year after year, letter by letter, until even the most familiar beloved can still surprise you with the depth of their heart and the breadth of their capacity for wonder. In their bedroom, as George helped Norma put the precious letters away in her jewelry box for safekeeping, she turned to him with eyes that sparkled with mischief and possibility. "So when does this courtship begin, Mr. Strait?" He smiled, feeling younger than he had in decades. "How about first thing tomorrow morning? I have some catching up to do, and I believe I owe you about 50 years' worth of love letters." And as they settled into sleep, both George and Norma were already composing the first words of their next chapter, a story that would prove that the most beautiful love songs are not always about falling in love for the first time, but sometimes about having the courage to fall in love again and again with the same person, until that love becomes a masterpiece, painted in shades of time and devotion that only grow more beautiful with each passing year. The morning sun streamed through their bedroom windows like liquid gold, painting everything in warm hues that seemed to promise new beginnings. George woke before Norma, as he had for most of their married life, but instead of slipping quietly out of bed to start his morning routine, he lay still and watched her sleep. Her face was peaceful in the early light, and he could see traces of the 18-year-old girl he had fallen in love with in the curve of her cheek and the way her hair fanned across the pillow. The jewelry box sat on her nightstand, holding the letters that had changed everything between them just hours before. Looking at it, George felt a surge of creative energy unlike anything he had experienced in years. The words from those yellowed pages seemed to be rearranging themselves in his mind, forming new patterns and melodies that begged to be given voice. Careful not to wake Norma, he slipped out of bed and made his way to his home studio, a converted spare bedroom where he kept his guitars and recording equipment. The room was his sanctuary, filled with instruments that had traveled with him around the world and awards that marked the milestones of a career that had exceeded even his wildest teenage dreams. But this morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was the song that was building in his chest like pressure in a steam kettle, demanding release. He picked up his oldest acoustic guitar, the same Martin he had been playing when he first met Norma, and let his fingers find the chords that matched the melody in his head. The song came easily, as if it had been waiting inside him for 50 years, needing only the catalyst of those rediscovered letters to finally emerge. The lyrics told the story of two young hearts writing love letters they never delivered, of promises kept across decades, of love that deepened like wine in a cellar until it became something richer and more complex than its makers had ever imagined possible. But more than that, it was a song about second chances and the courage to fall in love again with someone you had already loved for a lifetime. George lost himself in the music, playing and replaying verses, adjusting melodies, searching for the perfect way to capture the emotions that had overwhelmed them both the night before. He was so absorbed in his work that he did not hear Norma's footsteps in the hallway, did not notice her standing in the doorway in her robe, listening with tears in her eyes as he gave voice to their story. "That is beautiful," she said softly when he paused between verses, causing him to look up with the startled expression of an artist caught in the vulnerable act of creation. "You are supposed to be sleeping," he said, setting the guitar aside and reaching for her hand to draw her into the room. "I did not mean to wake you." "I woke up and you were not there," she replied, settling into the chair beside him that she had occupied during countless late-night writing sessions over the years. "I heard the music and knew you were creating something special. Is it about us?" George nodded, suddenly feeling as nervous as he had the night before when he handed her that 50-year-old letter. "It is about the letters, about what they showed us, about the love we have built together. I know it sounds presumptuous to think anyone else would care about our story, but something about last night felt universal, like maybe other people have experienced what we experienced." Norma smiled, reaching over to trace the worn wood of his guitar with reverent fingers. "George Strait, you have made a living telling stories that touch people's hearts. Trust me, this story will touch hearts too. Play it for me again, from the beginning." So he did, watching her face as he sang about young love and old promises, about letters that waited 50 years to find their destination, about the miracle of rediscovering wonder in the arms of someone who had been beside you all along. When he finished, Norma was crying again, but these were tears of joy and recognition. "That song needs to be heard by the world," she said firmly. "Not just because it is beautiful, though it is, but because it gives people permission to believe that love can last, that it can grow stronger instead of weaker, that it is never too late to fall in love again with the person you married." Over the following days, George refined the song, adding verses that captured the specific moments from their letters that had moved him most deeply. He wrote about the injured sparrow by Miller's Creek, about walking in the rain under a shared jacket, about promises made in teenage handwriting that had proven prophetic. The song became a complete narrative of their love story, from those first tentative letters to the renewed commitment they had made to each other in their kitchen. When he finally felt ready to share it beyond their home, George called his longtime producer, a man who had worked with him through dozens of albums and understood both his artistic vision and his perfectionist tendencies. The producer listened to a rough recording George had made in his home studio, and the silence that followed stretched long enough to make George nervous. "George," the producer finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "in 30 years of working with you, I have never heard you sing anything more honest or more beautiful. This is not just a song. It is a love letter to everyone who has ever wondered if their love story still matters after the passion fades into companionship." The recording session was unlike any George had ever experienced. Usually meticulous about multiple takes and technical perfection, this time he found that the first take captured something that could not be improved upon through repetition. The raw emotion in his voice, the slight tremor when he sang about finding the letters, the way his voice broke just slightly when he reached the verse about their daughter, all of it was perfect in its imperfection. Norma was there for the session, sitting in the control booth with tears streaming down her face as she heard their private story transformed into something that could touch strangers' hearts. When George finished singing, the studio was completely silent except for the soft sound of people weeping. Hardened music industry professionals moved to tears by the simple honesty of enduring love. The song, which George titled "Letters Never Sent," became something unprecedented in his long career. It reached #1 on the country charts, but more than that, it crossed over to touch audiences who rarely listened to country music. Radio stations received calls from listeners sharing their own stories of rediscovered love, of marriages renewed by the courage to be vulnerable again, of couples inspired to write their own letters to each other. The music video, which featured home movies from George and Norma's actual life together, became a viral sensation. Viewers were moved by the authenticity of their story, by footage of their young selves that gradually transitioned to their current ages, by the obvious love that still sparkled between them after more than 5 decades together. But the most meaningful response came from their own family. Their surviving children called to say that hearing the song had helped them understand their parents' relationship in a new way. that it had shown them what they should aspire to in their own marriages. Their grandchildren, who had always known Grandma and Grandpa loved each other but had perhaps taken that love for granted, suddenly saw their grandparents as romantic heroes whose love story rivaled any fairy tale. The success of the song led to opportunities that George had never expected at this stage of his career. Television appearances where he and Norma sat side by side, sharing their story and the lessons they had learned about keeping love alive across decades. Book offers from publishers who wanted them to write about marriage and commitment, speaking engagements at marriage conferences and relationship seminars. But more important than any professional success was what the song did for George and Norma personally. The act of sharing their story so publicly had deepened their commitment to the renewed courtship they had promised each other that night in their kitchen. George did indeed begin writing Norma letters again, not just on special occasions, but whenever the mood struck him, leaving them on her pillow or tucked into her purse for her to discover throughout her day. Norma, inspired by his example, began her own letter-writing campaign, leaving notes in his guitar cases before he left for the few concerts he still performed, tucking messages into his coffee cup in the morning, writing her thoughts and feelings with the same honest vulnerability she had shown as a teenager. Their friends and family noticed the change in them immediately. There was a spark in their interactions, a playfulness that had been missing for years. They held hands more often, looked into each other's eyes during conversations, laughed at each other's jokes with genuine delight rather than polite familiarity. One evening, 6 months after finding the letters, they sat on their front porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. The scene was exactly what teenage Norma had envisioned in her letter all those years ago. Two people who had grown old together but had never stopped seeing the magic in each other. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had given each other those letters when we first wrote them?" Norma asked, her hand resting comfortably in George's as they rocked in the chairs he had built for their 40th anniversary. George considered the question seriously, watching as their youngest grandson attempted to catch fireflies in the gathering dusk. "I think we needed to be the people we are now to truly appreciate what those letters meant," he said finally. "At 19 we knew we loved each other, but we had not yet learned what love could do. We had not yet discovered how it could survive loss and disappointment and the simple wearing away of time. Finding those letters now, after we have proven to ourselves and each other that our love is strong enough to weather anything, it means something different than it would have meant then." Norma squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. "So you think everything happened exactly as it was supposed to?" "I think," George said, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss that still made her heart flutter after all these years, "that we are exactly where we are supposed to be, with exactly the right person at exactly the right time. And I think we have the rest of our lives to keep discovering new reasons to fall in love with each other." As the sun set over their Texas ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed designed specifically for lovers, George and Norma Strait sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love well tended. The letters that had started it all were safely tucked away in Norma's jewelry box, but their influence continued to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Their love story, which had begun with two teenagers too scared to deliver letters to each other, had become something larger than themselves. It had become proof that true love not only exists, but can thrive across decades, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing year. It had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever wondered if their own love story still mattered, if their own marriage could be rekindled, if it was possible to fall in love again with someone you had already loved for a lifetime. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest gift those 50-year-old letters had given them, not just the renewal of their own love, but the opportunity to show the world that some kinds of magic never fade. They only deepen with time until they become something approaching the sacred, something worthy of celebration, something worth writing songs about and sharing with anyone brave enough to believe that love, real love, is still possible in a world that often seems to have forgotten what it looks like.